My father looked at me with that familiar expression, the one that never needed to ask permission, the one that assumed agreement before it was given. There was a faint curve at the corner of his mouth, not warmth, not cruelty, either, just certainty. He pointed toward the side of the room where a single chair sat slightly apart from everything else close to the service area, where waiters moved in practiced patterns carrying trays of champagne and appetizers. "The VIP table is for family only," he said. He did not lower his voice. He did not raise it. He spoke at exactly the volume required to be heard by the people closest to us, which meant it was heard by more than that. A few heads turned automatically. A pause moved through the air, brief but unmistakable, the kind that registers even if no one acknowledges it. I stayed quiet. I did not argue. I did not search for someone's eyes to rescue me. I walked to the chair he had pointed at, set my bag down carefully so it would not jut into the aisle, pulled the chair in without letting it scrape against the floor, and sat down. I folded my hands in my lap and let the moment pass, the way I had learned to let things pass in this family. Nothing happened. The room continued exactly as it had been continuing. My mother's eyes flicked in my direction for half a second, then slid away as if she had caught something reflective she did not want to see. She lifted her glass and leaned into a conversation already in motion. My brother Cole did not turn around at all. He was standing where the room naturally bent toward him, smiling, nodding, receiving congratulations like they belonged to him by default. My father moved on immediately, already greeting the next guest, the gesture behind him erased as soon as it was done. The scent of gardenias drifted from the centerpieces at the main tables, mixing with the warm smell of roasted meat from the kitchen. Somewhere a string quartet played something classical that I should have recognized but could not name at that moment. The clink of silverware against porcelain created a rhythm underneath everything steady and indifferent. From where I sat, I could see everything clearly. The VIP table had been draped in cream-colored linen with gold accents. Fresh flowers cascaded from crystal vases. The chairs there were upholstered comfortable, designed for people who were meant to stay. My chair was metal with a thin cushion, the kind venues keep in storage for overflow seating. The kind that says you are present, but not expected to matter. I watched the room settle into itself. The chairs shifted. Voices found their volume. Attention folded inward toward the center, tightening around my family like a fist closing. I became part of the margin. Close enough to see everything, distant enough to be unnecessary. It was a clean arrangement. It required no explanation because no one was going to ask for one. This was my brother's wedding, the wedding I had spent 3 months helping to plan. I had coordinated with the caterer when my mother said she was too busy. I had managed the seating chart when my father said it was too complicated. I had handled the last-minute venue change when Cole said he trusted me to figure it out. Every phone call, every email, every small crisis that threatened to derail this perfect day had passed through my hands before anyone else even knew there was a problem. And now, I was sitting next to the service corridor, watching a waiter pass by with a tray of shrimp cocktails that did not stop at my chair. The toast began near the VIP table. My father stood with his glass raised, his voice carrying that practiced warmth he used for important occasions. He thanked everyone for coming. He praised the bride and groom. He mentioned the vendors, the venue, and the beautiful weather that had cooperated so perfectly. He spoke about family and tradition, and the importance of gathering together to celebrate moments like this. He did not mention me. I listened without reacting, my posture unchanged. The applause rose and fell in coordinated waves. Glasses clinked. People leaned toward one another at the main tables, their bodies angled inward, creating a closed shape that included everyone who mattered and excluded everyone who did not. A server passed nearby carrying a tray of champagne flutes. The tray paused at the VIP table glasses, distributed quickly and efficiently to my parents, my brother, his new wife Savannah, her parents, and the important guests. The server moved on without stopping at my chair. It was not rude. It was just efficient. I had not signaled. I had not interrupted the path. The system was working exactly as designed. I thought about the weeks leading up to this night, how often my phone buzzed with my name attached to the solution. When something needed fixing, I was there. When something needed celebrating, the shape of the room changed. The realization was not new, but sitting here made it impossible to dress up in explanations anymore. My brother laughed at something someone said, the sound bright and easy. He had never had to work for that ease. It had been given to him the same way this wedding had been given to him, the same way attention and forgiveness and second chances had always been given to him. When Cole forgot something, there was always a story ready to explain why it made sense. When I forgot something, explanations were expected, not offered. The music shifted to something slower, more romantic. Couples began moving toward the dance floor. My mother smiled at my father in that practiced way. She had the smile that looked warm from a distance, but meant nothing up close. They joined the other couples moving together in a way that suggested partnership to anyone watching. I knew better. I had watched them my whole life. I knew the difference between performance and truth. Savannah's mother glanced in my direction, once her expression flickering with something that might have been confusion or might have been pity. She turned away quickly, choosing not to know what she had just seen. That was easier. That was always easier. I stayed where I was. There was no heat in it, no rush of humiliation demanding action. The feeling was colder than that, cleaner. The chair had not been an accident. It had not been impulsive. It had been waiting for me long before tonight, built by every moment I had stepped back so someone else could step forward, every time I had swallowed a reaction, so the group could move on, every decision made without me in the room that I had been expected to execute anyway. The understanding settled quietly, the way a fact does when it has been true for a long time and you finally stop arguing with it. The distance between me and the VIP table was not large, maybe 20 feet. But it was firm, it was held. They were together. I was not. No one came to explain. No one apologized. No one checked if I was okay. The absence of those gestures said more than any confrontation could have. They had always decided where I belonged. Tonight they had just made it visible, and they thought this was the end of it. The call came in while I was halfway through dinner at my apartment, my phone buzzing against the table like it always did when something had already gone wrong somewhere. I did not let it ring long enough to feel like a choice. I stepped into the hallway, lowered my voice out of habit, even though no one else was there, and listened, while my mother explained there was an issue with the wedding planning, nothing major, just one of those things. But could I possibly help sort it out before it became a bigger problem? She did not ask if I was free. She did not ask if I wanted to. She just paused in the way that assumed I had already said yes. I said yes, because that was the role I had been practicing for years. The one where I showed up not because I was wanted, but because I was reliable. That was how it usually started. Not with celebration or invitation, but with urgency. Something was late. Someone had not confirmed. A plan needed adjusting. I was the call you made when time was tight and excuses were no longer useful. I did not mind at first. Being needed felt close enough to being included that I did not question the difference. I showed up on time. I followed through. I did not turn small things into conversations. If there was friction, I smoothed it. If there was silence, I filled it. Over time, those traits hardened into expectations. I did not have to be asked anymore. Tasks landed with my name already attached like luggage sent ahead to a destination everyone else was enjoying. The pattern started before I was old enough to recognize it as a pattern. I was 12 years old when my grandmother held her 70th birthday party in the backyard of my parents' house. The afternoon was hot, the kind of Midwestern summer heat that made everything slower and heavier. Cole was supposed to help set up the folding tables, but he had disappeared with his friends to play basketball at the park down the street. My mother sent me to find him, and I walked 3 blocks in the heat, found him laughing with his friends, and told him he needed to come back. He looked at me like I had asked him to solve a complicated math problem. Then he smiled that easy smile of his and said, "Just tell Mom I'm coming. I'll be there in a minute." I went back and told her. She nodded and said I should just help with the tables myself since I was already there. By the time the party started, I had set up all 12 tables arranged, the chairs helped my grandmother into her special seat, and fetched ice from the neighbor's freezer twice because we had run out. Cole arrived 20 minutes after the guests freshly showered, and my grandmother hugged him like he had just returned from war. Nobody mentioned the tables. Nobody mentioned the ice. My father clapped Cole on the shoulder and said, "There's my boy." I learned something in that moment, even if I could not have named it then. My effort was invisible. Cole's presence was an event. That dynamic repeated itself in different rooms at different ages. When I was 16, I spent an entire weekend helping my mother prepare for a dinner party she was hosting for my father's business partners. I polished silver-arranged flowers, set the table 3 times, because she kept changing her mind about the configuration. Cole was supposed to help, but he had a date, and my mother said it was fine. She did not want to make a big deal about it. During the dinner, one of the partners complimented the table setting. My mother smiled graciously and said, "It's all about having the right help." She did not look at me when she said it. She did not need to. The word help told me exactly where I stood. After that, I stopped waiting to be included. I just started doing it. I figured if I made myself essential, eventually someone would notice. Eventually the doing would become belonging. It never did. By the time I graduated from college, the roles were fixed. Cole was the one with potential, the one whose future everyone invested in. He changed majors 3 times, dropped out of one graduate program, started another, and eventually settled into a junior position at a banking firm where one of my father's friends had made a call on his behalf. My parents called it finding his path. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration and took an entry-level position at an investment fund to build my own career without their help, my father said it was good I was being practical. Practical, like ambition was something I should apologize for. The wedding preparations followed the same script. What started as, "Can you help with a few things?" became, "Clara will handle it," without anyone noticing the transition. I coordinated vendors, managed budgets, negotiated contracts. I spent hours on the phone smoothing over misunderstandings between my mother and Savannah's mother about the guest list. I rewrote the seating chart 4 times because my father kept adding people he had forgotten to mention. 3 weeks before the wedding, the original venue flooded. Water damage insurance claims, months of repairs needed. My mother called me crying at 11 o'clock at night saying everything was ruined. I spent the next 72 hours finding a new venue, renegotiating contracts, adjusting timelines, and coordinating with every vendor to make the transition seamless. I slept maybe 6 hours total during those 3 days. When my father announced the venue change to the rest of the family, he framed it as a fortunate upgrade. "We got lucky," he said. "The new place is even better." He did not mention how the luck had happened. He did not mention me at all. Cole sent me a text that said, "Thanks for helping with the venue thing." No phone call, no conversation. Just 5 words that reduced 72 hours of work to the venue thing. I typed back, "You're welcome," and deleted it 3 times before finally just hitting send. The favoritism was not dramatic. It was structural. It lived in the assumptions everyone made without examining them. Cole was the future. I was the support system. He was the investment. I was the maintenance. Every family gathering reinforced it so quietly that pointing it out would have seemed petty, oversensitive, making something out of nothing. But it was not nothing. It was everything. It was the foundation everything else was built on. By the time I sat in that chair at my brother's wedding, watching my family celebrate without me, I understood exactly how I had gotten there. I had walked there myself, step by step, believing that if I just kept being useful, eventually I would become valued. I had been wrong. The final 3 weeks before the wedding collapsed into a blur of phone calls, emails, and problems that arrived without warning and demanded immediate solutions. I moved through it like I had moved through everything else my family asked of me efficiently and without complaint, telling myself that this was temporary. One event, one last stretch of being useful. Then things would go back to whatever version of normal existed between us. But something was different this time. The problems were not just coming from my family anymore. They were coming from everywhere, and everyone seemed to know exactly who to call. The morning the final timeline was due to the coordinator, my mother called to tell me that Savannah's parents had added 15 people to the guest list without telling anyone. The caterer needed to know by noon. The venue needed updated numbers by 3. The seating chart I had spent 2 weeks perfecting was now obsolete. I asked why no one had mentioned this sooner. My mother sighed in that way she had the sigh that said I was being difficult by asking reasonable questions. "These things happen, Clara. Just fix it." I fixed it. I always fixed it. But then the florist called me directly, not my mother, not Cole, not the coordinator. Me. She had gotten my number from Savannah's mother, who had told her I was the one actually running things. The venue manager emailed me with questions about the timeline, copying me first and everyone else second. The photographer's assistant texted me to confirm details that should have gone through the official coordinator. The pattern was unmistakable. Somewhere along the way, my role had been communicated to the entire network of people involved in this wedding, not as the sister of the groom, not as a member of the family, as the person who handled things, the logistics person, the one you contact when you need something done. I had not introduced myself that way. I had not asked to be the point of contact, but somehow that was what I had become in everyone's mind. The week before the wedding, I met Savannah for what was supposed to be a simple lunch to go over final details. She arrived 20 minutes late, phone pressed to her ear, already mid-conversation with someone about her nail appointment. She smiled at me as she sat down, the kind of smile you give to someone whose name you have to remember rather than someone you actually know. She was beautiful in that effortless way that made you understand immediately why Cole had chosen her. Blonde hair that fell in perfect waves, nails that had clearly been done that morning, an engagement ring that caught the light every time she moved her hand. Everything about her suggested a life where details were handled by other people. When she finally hung up, she said, "Cole told me you've been handling everything. That's so sweet of you." Sweet. The word landed like a label being applied. Not impressive, not generous, sweet, like I was doing this out of some excess of niceness, rather than because no one else would. I smiled and said it was no problem. I asked if she had any final concerns about the arrangements. She thought about it for a moment, twirling a strand of hair around her finger. "Actually, yes. My mom is worried about the table placement. She doesn't want to be too close to your parents because you know they can be a lot." I knew. I had grown up with them. I was intimately familiar with how much they could be. I told her I would adjust the seating chart again. "Perfect," she said, already reaching for her phone to check a notification. Then she paused and looked up at me with an expression that was almost thoughtful. "Oh, my friend Rachel is coming to the wedding. She works with me at the firm. Very observant, that one. Notices everything." She laughed lightly, the way people laugh when they are sharing gossip, disguised as information. I told her, "You're the one to ask if she needs anything. You know, logistics and all that." The one to ask. Logistics and all that. I watched her scan the menu without reading it, watched her tap her perfect nails against the table, and I understood something I had not understood before. This was not just my family. This was the story they had told about me. The story that had traveled beyond our house, beyond our dinners, into the world Savannah inhabited. She was not being cruel. She was simply repeating what she had been taught. Clara handles things. Clara is helpful. Clara is not the sister you get to know. Clara is the sister you utilize. The realization was different from the ones I had carried before. Those had been about my family's blindness, their inability or unwillingness to see my value beyond function. This was about something larger. The narrative had escaped. It had become the way other people saw me too. Not because they had observed me and concluded I was only good for logistics, but because my family had told them so and they had no reason to question it. Savannah did not see me as a future sister-in-law. She saw me as a high-quality vendor who happened to share DNA with her husband. Someone to be appreciated the way you appreciate a good caterer or a reliable florist. Politely, distantly, with the understanding that the relationship was transactional. I smiled and said I would be happy to help her friend Rachel with anything she needed. "You're so good at this," Savannah said, already looking at her phone again. "Cole always says you're the reliable one." The reliable one, not the smart one, not the successful one, not the one with her own life and career and ambitions. The reliable one. the one who could be counted on to show up and fix things and never make a fuss about it. I wondered how many conversations had happened about me that I had never heard. How many times my family had described me to others in exactly these terms. How many people at this wedding would arrive already knowing that Clara was the one handling logistics before they ever learned anything else about me? The lunch ended with Savannah air-kissing my cheek and promising to see me at the rehearsal dinner. She walked out of the restaurant without looking back, phone already at her ear, moving on to the next thing on her list. I sat there for a few minutes longer, staring at the check she had not offered to split, understanding that the story of who I was had been written without my input and distributed without my knowledge. The rehearsal dinner happened 2 nights before the wedding at a restaurant my father had chosen because one of his business associates owned it. The private room was elegant candles everywhere, white tablecloths, wine that cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. I arrived early to make sure everything was set up correctly. I checked the place cards, confirmed the menu with the kitchen, and made sure the flowers matched the ones we had ordered. The restaurant manager greeted me by name, even though we had never met in person. He had been told I was the contact. He had been told to direct all questions to me. He treated me with the professional courtesy you extend to a wedding planner, not a family member. By the time the family started arriving, I was already tired, but no one would have known it from looking at me. I had learned a long time ago how to be tired without showing it. My parents entered like royalty, accepting compliments on the venue, the wine selection, the beautiful arrangements. My mother kissed cheeks and laughed at jokes, while my father shook hands with the confidence of a man who believed he had earned everything he had. Cole and Savannah arrived together, glowing the center of attention from the moment they walked through the door. No one asked where I had been for the past hour. No one wondered how everything had come together so perfectly. The seamlessness of the evening erased the labor behind it. I watched Savannah's parents greet my parents with the careful warmth of people who were now bound together by their children's choices. I watched the way my mother positioned herself in every photograph, the way my father commanded the room without raising his voice, the way Cole accepted congratulations like they were his birthright. And I watched the way people's eyes slid past me when I stood near my family, then sharpened with recognition when I moved toward the service area to handle a question. In one position, I was invisible. In the other, I was essential. The contrast was so consistent, it could have been choreographed. During dinner, the conversation turned to the wedding itself. My father raised his glass and spoke about family, about tradition, about the importance of moments like this. He thanked the restaurant owner. He thanked the guests for coming. He thanked Savannah's parents for raising such a wonderful daughter. He did not thank me. I watched the faces around the table as he spoke. Some of them knew. I could see it in the way they glanced toward me during the parts about family coming together, the way their expressions flickered with something that might have been confusion or might have been discomfort. They knew I had been working on this wedding for months. They knew because they had emailed me, called me, been directed to me. And now they were watching my father give a speech about family that did not include my name. Later, when the dessert had been served and people were mingling between courses, I found myself standing alone near the window looking out at the city lights. Savannah's father approached me, drink in hand, smiling politely but uncertain. "You're the sister, right?" he asked. "The one who's been handling the logistics, the sister who handles logistics, not the sister who handles logistics." As if handling logistics were part of my title, part of how I had been introduced to him. I confirmed that I was. He nodded, swirling his drink. "My wife says you've been a lifesaver. The seating chart alone would have driven her crazy." I thanked him for saying so. He studied me for a moment and something flickered across his face. Curiosity, maybe. Or the beginning of a question he decided not to ask. I could see him trying to reconcile the person standing in front of him with the description he had been given. The logistics person, the reliable one, the sister who handles things. "It's interesting," he said finally. "You don't really look like them." I was not sure if he meant it as an observation or an insult. I was not sure it mattered. "I take after my grandmother," I said, which was true and also the safest possible response. He nodded again, took another sip of his drink, and wandered back toward the other guests without saying goodbye. I stayed by the window a little longer, watching my family move through the room like they belonged there, like the evening was something that had simply happened, rather than something that had been built. I thought about all the people in this room who had never met me before tonight. Every single one of them had already been told a story about me. Clara handles logistics. Clara is reliable. Clara is helpful. The story had arrived before I did, and now everything I said or did would be filtered through it. I was not a person to be discovered. I was a function to be confirmed. The scope of what I was facing settled into my chest like a weight. This was not just about my family failing to see me. This was about an entire narrative that had been constructed and distributed without my consent. Changing how my family saw me would require changing how they talked about me, and changing how they talked about me would require them to admit that the way they had been talking about me was wrong. That was never going to happen. The day of the wedding arrived with perfect weather exactly as everyone had hoped. I woke up at 5 in the morning to start the final coordination. By 7, I was at the venue meeting with the setup team, confirming timelines, solving the first small crisis of the day when one of the flower deliveries was delayed. The venue coordinator greeted me like a colleague. The caterer asked for my approval on the table settings. The photographer's assistant confirmed the timeline with me before checking with anyone else. Everyone knew their contact. Everyone knew who was actually in charge. By the time my family arrived around noon, everything was already in place. The chairs were arranged perfectly. The flowers were beautiful. The timeline was running exactly as planned. I watched them enter the space I had created for them, watched them admire it without seeing me, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not sadness, something colder. The recognition that I was standing inside a story I had never agreed to tell. My mother floated through the venue, touching flower arrangements and nodding approvingly as if she had selected them herself. My father spoke to the venue manager with the authority of someone who had made all the decisions. Cole posed for photographs, with Savannah relaxed and happy, unburdened by any of the details that had made this day possible. And everyone they encountered already knew the story. Clara handles logistics. Clara is the reliable one. Clara is not really family in the way that matters. Clara is staff with a better title. I stood at the edge of the room and watched the narrative play out in real time. Every interaction confirmed it. Every assumption reinforced it. The story was bigger than any single moment or any single slight. It was the air everyone breathed, invisible and everywhere. I did not know yet that by the end of the evening I would be sitting in a metal chair near the service corridor, watching my family celebrate without me. I did not know that the months of work would be erased by a single gesture from my father, a single sentence that would tell me exactly where I had always stood. But I was beginning to understand something important. The problem was not just that my family did not see me. The problem was that they had taught everyone else not to see me either, and that was going to be much harder to change. The morning started before I was fully awake, my phone vibrating against the nightstand again and again, until it stopped feeling like an interruption and started feeling like an expectation. Messages stacked on top of each other, short and urgent, each one assuming I was already up, already dressed, already moving toward a solution for whatever had gone wrong overnight. I checked the first message, a timing change for the ceremony. The officiant had a conflict and needed to start 30 minutes earlier than planned. I checked the second message. The photographer wanted to confirm the location for the pre-ceremony shots. I checked the third message. My mother asked if I had handled the first 2 messages yet. I had not even gotten out of bed. By the time I arrived at the venue, the sun was already high and the heat was building in that slow, insistent way that promised an uncomfortable afternoon. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and the jasmine that had been planted along the entrance path. Inside, the air conditioning was working overtime, and the space felt cool and hollow, waiting to be filled. Everyone else seemed to have a place. The bride was guided from one room to another, stylists and photographers clearing paths for her without being asked. The groom was pulled aside for quiet conversations with groomsmen that ended in backslaps and laughter. My parents were greeted with deference by the venue staff, ushered into positions that required no explanation given coffee without requesting it. When people addressed me, they used instructions, not names. Can you handle this? We need one more thing. Have you checked on that I moved through the morning as a function rather than a person? The coordinator, Lila, caught my eye once and gave me a look that communicated something between sympathy and exhaustion. She knew. She had copied enough emails to know exactly who had been running point on this wedding for the past 3 months. Around 11, I caught fragments of a conversation happening in one of the side rooms. The door was partially open, and I recognized my father's voice immediately. "Everything looks good," he was saying. "We should be set." "The timeline changed, though," someone else said. I could not place the voice. One of the groomsmen, maybe. "Didn't the officiant move things up?" "Clara handled it," my father said. The words were flat functional, like mentioning that the plumber had fixed a leak. I walked past the door without stopping, but I carried those words with me for the rest of the morning. Clara handled it. Not "my daughter handled it." Not "Clara did a great job." Just a statement of fact as emotionally significant as noting that the weather was nice. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I stood in the back, not part of the wedding party, not seated with the family, just present, in that liminal way that made me easy to find when something went wrong, but impossible to notice when everything went right. I watched Cole and Savannah exchange vows, watched my mother dab at her eyes with a handkerchief, watched my father nod approvingly, as if he had personally orchestrated true love. The flowers were perfect. White roses and peonies, exactly what Savannah had wanted. The music swelled at exactly the right moments, because I had spent 2 hours the week before working with the string quartet to get the timing right. The officiant's words were beautiful, and the 30-minute timeline change had been absorbed seamlessly because I had woken up early to make it work. No one knew any of that. No one needed to. After the ceremony, the room began its transformation for the reception. I helped where I could without being in the way, adjusting a centerpiece here, confirming a detail with a server there. The coordinator had everything under control, but I could not stop myself from hovering. 3 months of investment did not switch off just because the event had started. My mother found me near one of the side tables, checking that the place cards were in the right order. She was glowing in that way she always glowed at events, performing warmth and graciousness for anyone who might be watching. "Clara, you should freshen up," she said. "The reception's about to start." I told her I was fine. She glanced around to make sure no one important was listening. "You look tired. Maybe some lipstick." I was tired. I had been tired for 3 months. But I told her I would take care of it, and watched her float away toward a group of guests who wanted to congratulate her on the beautiful ceremony. By the time the reception formally began, the hierarchy had fully reassembled itself. The VIP table was set up near the center of the room, the best position, the one that commanded attention, without demanding it. My parents, Cole and Savannah's parents, and a handful of other important guests were all seated there, their glasses already filled, their conversations already flowing. I stood near the entrance waiting. I was not sure what I was waiting for. An invitation, maybe? A gesture. Someone noticed that I was not seated and asked where I belonged. The minutes passed. Servers began moving through the room with trays of appetizers. The string quartet shifted to lighter music, something that encouraged conversation rather than ceremony. Guests found their tables, checked their place cards, settled into their seats. I was still standing there when my father approached. I thought for one brief moment that he was coming to bring me to the table, that whatever oversight had occurred was about to be corrected, that the months of work would finally be acknowledged with the simple gesture of being included. He stopped in front of me, that familiar expression on his face, the one that never asked permission, the one that assumed agreement. Then he pointed toward the side of the room, toward a single chair near the service area, and he spoke. "The VIP table is for family only." The words landed without drama. They did not need drama. They had the weight of years behind them, the accumulated certainty of a man who had never once questioned whether his decisions were correct. I walked to the chair. I sat down. I folded my hands in my lap. And I watched the rest of the evening begin without me. The room was already settling into itself by the time I reached the chair my father had pointed at. I could feel the eyes that followed me briefly before sliding away the calculations people made about whether to acknowledge what they had just seen or pretend they had not noticed. Most chose pretense. It was easier. It always was. The chair was metal with a thin cushion, the kind that leaves marks on the backs of your legs if you sit too long. It was positioned near the corridor where servers passed with their trays close enough to the action to witness everything but far enough away to be clearly separate. The placement was not accidental. Nothing in this family was ever accidental. I sat down and adjusted my posture until it felt natural. I did not fidget. I did not scan the room looking for rescue. I made myself still in the way I had learned to be still present but undemanding, visible but ignorable. The scent of roasted lamb drifted from the kitchen every time a server pushed through the swinging doors. The sound of glasses clinking at the VIP table carried across the space, punctuated by laughter that rose and fell in predictable patterns. Someone had requested a specific song from the quartet, and they played it now, something slow and romantic that made the lighting feel softer. From where I sat, I could see everything. The VIP table was beautiful in that effortless way that expensive things always look effortless. The cream-colored linen caught the candlelight. The flowers cascaded from crystal vases in carefully arranged disorder. The people seated there leaned toward one another as they spoke, bodies angled inward, creating a closed shape that needed nothing from outside it. My mother was radiant, performing joy with the precision of someone who had practiced it for decades. She touched my father's arm at exactly the right moments, laughed at exactly the right volume, made sure she was always in the frame of any photograph being taken. My father worked the table with easy authority, moving from conversation to conversation, making everyone feel attended to without ever appearing to rush. Cole sat beside Savannah, his hand occasionally resting on her back in that proprietary way that newlyweds have. He looked happy, genuinely happy, which somehow made everything worse. He was not calculating his happiness or wondering if he deserved it. He simply had it the way he had always simply had things that others worked for. Savannah looked perfect, which I supposed was the point of being a bride. Her dress had cost more than my car. Her hair had taken 3 hours to arrange. Every detail of her appearance had been calibrated for this moment, and the calibration had been successful. She glanced around the room occasionally, with the slightly bewildered expression of someone receiving more attention than they know what to do with. A server passed my chair carrying a tray of champagne flutes. The tray paused at the VIP table glasses, distributed with smooth efficiency. Then the server continued past me without stopping. The tray now empty the path uninterrupted. I watched it happen without reaction. There was nothing to react to. I had not signaled for a drink. I had not made eye contact. I had not inserted myself into the pattern of service. The oversight was technical, not personal. Except everything technical had been built on something personal first. The first toast began a few minutes later. My father stood glass raised and the room quieted by degrees until only his voice remained. He spoke about family, about love, about the traditions that bind generations together. He praised Cole's character. He welcomed Savannah into the family. He thanked the guests for their presence and their generosity. He did not look toward my chair once. The applause that followed was warm and genuine people moved by words they assumed came from the heart. Glasses lifted around the room. The VIP table became a constellation of raised crystal glittering in the candlelight. I did not have a glass to raise. No one had thought to bring me one, and I had not thought to ask. After the toast conversations resumed at their normal volume, the ceremony of attention dispersed back into smaller clusters. I watched the patterns form and dissolve, watched who approached whom and who was approached, watched the invisible architecture of social hierarchy assert itself through movement and proximity. A woman I recognized as one of Savannah's colleagues stopped near the edge of my vision. She was looking at me with an expression I could not quite read. Not pity, exactly. Something more like confusion, like she was trying to solve a problem she had not expected to encounter. She did not approach, but she did not look away either. She simply stood there, holding her champagne, watching me the way you watch something you are trying to understand. I met her eyes for a moment, then looked away. I did not need her intervention. I did not want her sympathy. I was gathering information, not allies. The second toast came from Savannah's father, a tall man with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone who had made money early and kept it. He spoke about his daughter, about the day she was born, about watching her grow into the woman who stood before them now. His voice carried genuine emotion, and when it cracked slightly near the end, I saw my mother reach for her handkerchief again. He thanked my parents for raising such a wonderful son. He thanked my brother for making his daughter happy. He thanked the universe half-jokingly for bringing their families together. He did not thank me for making sure the seating chart worked for handling the venue crisis for managing the timeline change this morning. He did not know about any of that, of course. No one had told him. No one would. The evening continued its careful choreography. Dinner was served in courses, each one arriving at the VIP table first, before spreading outward to the other guests. I received my plate eventually, the food lukewarm by the time it reached me, the presentation slightly less careful than what I could see at the main tables. I ate anyway. I was hungry, and refusing to eat would have been a statement I was not ready to make. Between courses, people began to move, circulating between tables, reconnecting with friends and relatives they had not seen in years. Some of them glanced toward me as they passed, their expressions flickering through recognition and uncertainty before settling into polite neutrality. A few nodded. Most did not. No one stopped to ask why the woman who had organized much of this wedding was sitting alone near the service corridor. Maybe they assumed there was a reason. Maybe they preferred not to know. Near the end of the main course, I saw my father look toward me for the first time since he had pointed at the chair. His expression was evaluating rather than concerned, assessing whether the situation was under control, whether I was going to cause a problem. I kept my face neutral and let him look. Whatever he saw satisfied him because he turned away and resumed his conversation without any change in his demeanor. The assessment was complete. I had passed the test by not existing loudly enough to require acknowledgement. The VIP table continued to glow in the center of the room, collecting attention like light collected by a lens. Everyone who mattered was there. Everyone who was present noticed. And I sat 20 feet away, close enough to see everything far enough away to see it clearly for the first time. They thought this was the end of something. They thought my silence was compliance. They thought the chair they had chosen for me would hold me exactly where they wanted me to stay. They were wrong. The reception kept moving as if nothing had shifted, music swelling and dipping on schedule, laughter rolling across the room, servers threading between tables with trays held steady. But the timing underneath had started to loosen in ways that only certain people would notice. I noticed. The transition to the cake cutting was supposed to happen at 8:15. The coordinator had the timeline printed on a laminated card she carried in her pocket. The photographer was positioned and ready. The baker's assistant was standing by with the ceremonial knife. But the MC had not made the announcement. The 8:15 moments came and went, and the room continued as if nothing was due. Lila scanned the space, her expression professional, but her eyes moving faster than they should have been. She was looking for someone. I knew exactly who. Her gaze passed over the VIP table, landed on me for half a second, then flicked away. I saw the moment she remembered the new arrangement, the moment she chose not to cross the room to my chair. She approached Cole instead, leaning down to whisper something near his ear. He nodded without really listening, his attention still on the guest he had been speaking with. Lila waited. Cole continued his conversation. She waited longer. Eventually, she stepped back and improvised. She signaled the MC, directly cued the photographer to be ready, and managed the transition herself. It worked. The cake cutting happened only a few minutes late, and most guests probably did not notice the delay. But the polish had dulled slightly. The seamless quality I had worked so hard to build was no longer self-correcting. 20 minutes later, another problem surfaced. The string quartet was supposed to hand off to the DJ at 9 o'clock, but no one had confirmed the exact changeover with both parties. They had been told separately, and their understandings did not match. I could hear the conversation happening near the service area. Voices low but urgent, the kind of tension that builds when people realize something has slipped through the cracks. The DJ was ready. The quartet wanted to finish one more piece. Neither wanted to yield. Lila appeared again this time, looking more openly stressed. She tried to find Cole, but he was on the dance floor with Savannah. She looked toward my parents, but my father was in the middle of a conversation with someone important, and my mother was taking photographs with a group of relatives. Her eyes found me again. This time she hesitated, genuinely weighing whether to approach me. I watched her calculate the cost of asking for help versus the cost of figuring it out alone. The calculation must have tilted toward her pride because she turned away and dealt with it herself, compromising between the two musical groups with a solution that worked but lacked grace. I stayed in my chair and let her solve it. There was no satisfaction in watching the system struggle. There was only the clear recognition that the system had been dependent on labor I had provided for free, and now that labor was no longer being offered, the dependency was showing. My father noticed before my mother did. I saw it in the way his smile tightened after the music transition and the pause after a laugh, when something did not land the way it usually did. He glanced around the room with an expression I had never seen him before. Not concern, exactly. Alertness. The recognition that something was different without understanding what. His eyes found me eventually seated in my metal chair, hands folded, posture relaxed. I met his gaze without offering anything. No reassurance, no explanation, just presence. He looked away first. A groomsman, whose name I had forgotten, approached Lila with a question about the order of speeches. The speeches. Another detail I had spent hours coordinating, balancing egos and timing, and the emotional flow of the evening. Lila checked her notes, frowned, and gave an answer that was correct but uncertain. The groomsman accepted it and walked away. Cole felt the shift next. Someone asked him directly about the next scheduled event, and he answered with his usual confidence, but the answer was wrong. The person looked confused. Cole laughed and tried to redirect, but the confusion lingered. I watched Savannah step in and smooth it over, offering an alternative explanation that was also slightly wrong, but delivered with enough warmth that it did not matter. She was learning already, I realized. Learning to cover for him. Learning to fill the gaps. The next hour continued in this pattern. Small questions that used to have immediate answers now required consultation. Decisions that used to be made invisibly now had to be discussed. The machinery of the evening continued to function, but the automatic quality was gone. My mother attempted to restore equilibrium with warmth, drifting between groups, touching arms, laughing at familiar jokes. But her laughter came a beat late now, and when she said, "Isn't everything wonderful?" the responses were slightly muted, tinged with awareness that something was not quite landing. A man from one of the earlier planning meetings finally approached me directly. He leaned in, voice low, and said, "We need someone to confirm the departure time with the valet service." He did not ask. He informed me. The assumption was already in place. I looked at him calmly and asked, "Who's responsible for that?" The question hung in the air for a moment, unexpected. He blinked. "I thought you were handling the logistics," he said. "I helped with the planning," I said, "but I'm a guest tonight." Another pause. He looked toward the VIP table, then back at me, then toward Lila, who was handling 3 things at once near the entrance. "Right," he said finally. "I'll find Lila." He walked away, and I returned my attention to the room. The consequence of my restraint was not dramatic. There was no disaster, no catastrophe, just friction. Small moments of confusion that added up to a different kind of evening than the one everyone had imagined. People adapted, they always do, but the ease was gone, and its absence left fingerprints everywhere. Near the end of the hour, my father crossed the room and stopped a few feet from my chair. He did not sit down. He did not crouch to put himself at my level. He stood looking down at me with an expression that mixed evaluation and something I could not quite name. "Is everything all right over here?" he asked. The question sounded like concern, but I had known him long enough to recognize reconnaissance when I heard it. "Everything's fine," I said. "Beautiful evening." He waited as if expecting me to say something else, to offer something, to fill the gap the way I always had. I did not. After a moment, he nodded, once turned, and walked back toward the VIP table. His stride was slightly less confident than before. The certainty that had always surrounded him flickered briefly. I stayed in my chair and watched the evening continue around me. They were all waiting for me to step back in to smooth what had frayed, to restore the seamless quality they had always taken for granted. I did not. The room carried a different kind of quiet after the earlier difficulties. Not silence, but awareness. Conversation slowed at natural breaks, bodies angled just enough to keep me in view, the same expectations circulating without being spoken. Everyone assumed I would step back and smooth what had frayed, restore the ease they had come to depend on. I remained at the edge, not hiding, not withdrawing, simply not advancing. Servers regrouped on their own. The staff checked printed schedules instead of searching for me. The room tried to correct itself. I was not refusing anything directly. I was simply choosing when to engage instead of reacting automatically. The restraint felt physical, like holding still a muscle that had been trained for years to move on command. The next problem was larger. A timing conflict between the scheduled toasts and the band's break had surfaced, and no one could resolve it quietly. A few people spoke at once, then stopped. Phones came out. Eyes scanned the room. The expectation returned stronger, now traveling from person to person instead of settling on one face. They wanted a solution without being the one to ask for it. Messages moved sideways instead of forward. Someone leaned in and murmured something to someone else, then nodded toward me without making it obvious. Another person joined the conversation, listened, and stepped away. The request reached me diluted, stripped of ownership. No one wanted to be seen assigning it. No one wanted to risk hearing a word they were not expecting. When it finally arrived, it came as information rather than instruction. A woman I vaguely recognized from the catering company appeared near my chair and said, "There's an issue with the next transition." She did not meet my eyes, as if the problem existed independently of any human being. I listened without reacting immediately. "Who's responsible for it?" I asked. The question landed harder than refusal would have. It required an answer no one had prepared. A pause followed. A name was offered, then withdrawn. Someone said Lila, then someone else said Cole had signed off on the timeline originally. I did not let the space fill itself. "What's the plan if that doesn't work?" I asked. No accusation, no edge, just the expectation that there would be a plan. The air shifted. A few people looked surprised. Others tightened, irritated at having to articulate what they were used to outsourcing. The old order had relied on my silence to move fast. My questions slowed it just enough to be noticeable. My father appeared beside me before I realized he had crossed the room. His tone was familiar, measured the voice he used when he expected compliance without argument. "Clara, let's not make this complicated," he said. "People are trying to enjoy themselves." He framed it as consideration for the guests, as if my presence in the chair had been my choice and my behavior now was disrupting what should have been a simple celebration. I did not argue. I did not explain. I asked again, keeping my voice even. "Who's responsible for coordinating this part of the evening?" My father's expression flickered, just briefly. Then he smiled that practiced smile and said, "We'll handle it. Just relax and enjoy yourself." The words were meant to close the conversation. They were meant to put me back in my place, the place where my participation was limited to execution and my questions were unwelcome. I nodded once and said nothing else. He waited a moment, uncertain whether he had won the exchange, then turned and walked back toward the VIP table. I watched him intercept Lila, watched him say something to her with his hand on her shoulder, watched her nod and move toward the source of the conflict. The solution came together eventually. The timing issue was resolved by cutting the band's break short and shifting one of the toasts to later in the evening. It worked, but it was visible. People had to adjust. The seamless quality everyone expected had been replaced by something rougher, more human. That was when my brother was drawn into a conversation he had not prepared for. A guest, one of Savannah's relatives, approached Cole with a question about the photographer's schedule for the after-party. Simple enough, except Cole did not know the answer. He hesitated, laughed lightly, and tried to redirect, but the relative was genuinely curious and did not let it go. "Didn't you set this up?" she asked. "I thought you were handling the timeline." Cole's confidence wavered, just for a moment. He glanced toward our father, then back to the relative, then toward the coordinator station, where Lila was occupied with something else. "I think Clara had the details on that," he said finally. The words hung in the air. The relative turned to look for me, found me in my chair near the service area, and her expression shifted through several emotions I could not quite read. She did not come to ask me directly. She simply turned back to Cole and said, "I'll check with the photographer myself." Cole nodded relieved, and the moment passed. But something had been exposed. The center was not as self-sufficient as it appeared. The authority that had always surrounded my brother relied on scaffolding that was not currently in place. My mother noticed the exchange from across the room. I saw her eyes move between Cole and me, calculating something, then settling into that smooth expression that meant she had decided to address it later. I stayed where I was, not central, not hidden. People came to me with practical questions. I answered them briefly and accurately, without volunteering anything beyond what was asked. Others passed with nods that acknowledged competence rather than obligation. The room began to reorganize itself around function instead of status, and no one announced it because no one needed to. When my father passed me again later, our eyes met briefly. There was no anger there, just recognition. The rules he had relied on were shifting in front of witnesses. By the time the next song began, the transformation was quietly underway. To anyone not paying attention, the party looked the same. To those who were watching, the hierarchy had begun to wobble. I did not feel like I had won anything. What I felt was alignment. The relief of no longer carrying the expectation alone. And they still did not understand what that meant. I stepped away from the reception with a purpose that had nothing to do with escaping. The coordinator needed confirmation on the cake timing, and I wanted to make sure the photographer's cue was still aligned with the band's next break. Practical things, small things, the kind of details that used to pull me automatically. This time I moved toward them without urgency, no guilt, no rush. I cut through a side hallway, checked the email thread I had created weeks earlier to keep vendors from colliding, and listened to the muted hum of the party behind me. The air was cooler here, away from the crowd. I could smell the cleaning supplies stored in a closet nearby, the faint chlorine from the venue's pool on the other side of the building. Then I heard my father's voice close enough to be unguarded. "We just need to keep it simple." My mother answered immediately, her tone low but settled. "Exactly. No drama. Not tonight." I slowed without deciding to. It was not what they said at first. It was how easily they said it, the way they spoke about the evening, like a system they were managing rather than a celebration unfolding. I stopped near the corner where people usually pause to adjust shoes or fix their hair. I stayed still because my body understood before my mind did. If I moved, I would announce myself. If I stayed, they would keep talking. "She's been on a short leash all day, and it's worked," my father said. "The second she's near the main table, people start asking her questions. And then she starts answering," my mother added. "It's not that she's trying to show off," he continued. "She just fills the gaps." He said my name without inflection. "Clara does what Clara does," my brother joined in. "I told you, it's better this way. Savannah doesn't need her fielding things at our table. It looks weird. You don't want your sister answering vendor questions while your wife's trying to enjoy herself," my father said. "And we don't need Clara feeling entitled," my mother said. That word landed cleanly. Entitled, not hurt, not excluded, entitled. As if a seat at the family table were something you earned through good behavior, rather than something you were born into. "She'll understand," my father said without hesitation. "She always does," my mother replied. "That's why this works," he continued. "She doesn't make a scene." "If she was going to," my brother said, "she would have already." "She won't," my father said. "She's too responsible." The word sounded like a tool, like a lever they had learned to pull. "It's one night," my mother said. "And if she makes it about herself," my father asked. "Then we keep her busy," my brother replied. "She's useful when she's occupied." Useful. "That's the point," my father said. "We don't give her a place where she can be seen. We give her a place where she can't interrupt." "And she won't say anything," my mother added. "She won't want to ruin it." I kept my eyes on my phone screen, dimmed, an unread email open. What rose in me was not anger. It was clear. The chair had not been a lapse in judgment. It had not been an oversight. It had been placed, Designed. The same way the lighting was designed, the same way the seating chart was designed. I was a variable in their calculations, one they had learned to control. People are already asking who did what, my father said. We just keep the narrative clean. Savannah's dad asked about the schedule change, my brother said. We say it was the coordinator's call, my mother replied. No need to say Clara handled it. We didn't lean on her, my father said. She offered. That was not true. The ease with which he rewrote reality told me everything I needed to know. If her parents think she ran half the day, my brother said, they'll think we're incompetent. We're not, my father replied. We're celebrating. Clara's just backstage. Their footsteps shifted. They were heading back toward the reception. I stayed still until they passed, until the hallway swallowed their voices. My father said one last thing, quieter but certain. She'll understand. She always has. They left the sentence behind like a smell you could not ignore. I did not need to interpret it. They had handed me the blueprint. When their footsteps were gone, I breathed. One long breath, then another. Then I turned back toward the coordinator's station phone, still in my hand. Cake at 9:15, I said evenly. Give the photographer 2 minutes. Lila nodded and moved on. I did not linger. I did not confess what I had heard. I walked back into the reception as if I had only stepped out briefly. The music hit first, then laughter, then the bright clatter of silverware against porcelain. The VIP table glowed. My brother stood near it, hand at Savannah's back, perfectly placed. My father worked the room with practiced ease. My mother smiled too steadily, like someone who had rehearsed the expression in a mirror. No one looked at me like I had just been discussed. That was the strangest part. They did not feel guilty. They felt justified. I returned to the edge of the room near the single chair and waited a moment before sitting. I watched instead, not with longing, with precision. My father's laughter was not joy. It was controlled. My mother's touch was not warm. It was reassurance of position. My brother's intimacy with his new wife was a performance, and the room responded the way rooms always respond to confidence rather than truth. When I sat, it was unremarkable. A server stopped at the VIP table first. Glasses lifted. A toast was made. The tray passed me by. Either no one noticed or noticing felt inconvenient. I was not in their story. I was the mechanism behind it. And now I knew the mechanism was intentional. I stayed still, not plotting, not angry, just aware. They had mistaken my restraint for reliability, my quiet for compliance, my position for acceptance. What they never questioned was the part that mattered most. I had already made my choice. A woman I did not recognize at first stopped beside me as the music swelled and dipped again. She had been hovering near the edge of the room for a while, a champagne flute in her hand that she did not seem to be drinking from. Are you okay? The question was not urgent, not theatrical, just enough to leave space for a real answer. I placed her as one of Savannah's colleagues, someone I had been introduced to earlier and then absorbed into the blur of faces and congratulations. She had short dark hair and earrings that caught the light when she moved her head. Her expression was direct without being aggressive. I nodded once out of habit. She did not take it as closure. I saw what happened, she said. No glance around to make sure no one was listening. No lowering her voice further. That wasn't right. I did not explain. I did not minimize. I did not rush to protect anyone's comfort. I let the sentence sit between us. She was not asking for context. She was not waiting to be convinced. She had already seen enough to decide what she thought. The relief that followed was not emotional. It was structural, like setting something down that had been occupying both hands without you noticing the strain. She stayed beside me a moment longer than politeness required, then said, "If you need anything, let me know," and returned to the crowd. As she merged back into the room, I noticed something shifting in small ways. 2 people near the bar leaned closer together. One of them glanced toward the VIP table, then toward me, curiosity flickering and settling. Nothing dramatic, just awareness beginning to circulate. A few minutes later, a man with his tie loosened and a drink untouched asked casually but not idly, Who's been running point on all this?" He nodded toward the coordinator station, toward the service area, toward the quiet machinery that had kept the evening moving. His eyes passed over me and away, as if the connection had not quite been authorized yet. Before I could respond, the woman from earlier spoke from behind him. "She has." The man turned back to me, eyebrows lifting. Not impressed exactly, recalibrating. "Oh," he said. "Got it." He did not ask follow-up questions. He did not demand credentials. He adjusted his understanding and moved on. That was how it began. Not with confrontation, not with speeches, with small corrections passed between people who had nothing invested in maintaining my family's version of events. My father noticed before my mother did. I saw it in the way his smile tightened as he scanned the room in the pause after a laugh when the response did not land the way it usually did. He caught the tail end of a look that was not deferential, a glance that held assessment instead of admiration, and his eyes flicked toward me again. This time, there was uncertainty there, faint but unmistakable. He crossed the room quickly, intercepting a conversation, his voice lifting hands, moving, reclaiming space with the ease of long practice. People smiled, they nodded, but they did not lean in the same way. The rhythm had changed. My brother felt it next. Someone asked him a question that required specifics, nothing pointed, just practical. He answered the first part easily, then hesitated. He laughed lightly and tried to redirect, but the person asking waited. The pause stretched. Savannah stepped in and answered what she could. The moment passed, but the impression stayed. The center was not as self-sufficient as it looked. I stayed where I was, not retreating, not advancing, letting the room do what rooms do when truth circulates without a spokesperson. Another person stopped near me, someone from my brother's college years, vaguely familiar. She set a glass of water beside me on the small side table. "You've been everywhere today," she said. "I don't know how you're still standing." It was not praise meant to elevate. It was recognition of function stated plainly. "She's been amazing," someone else added nearby, almost surprised by their own clarity. No one looked to the VIP table for confirmation. My mother attempted to gather the room back with warmth drifting between groups, touching arms, laughing at jokes she had already heard. When she reached one circle and said, "Isn't everything beautiful?" the response came a beat late. Eyes flicked toward the coordinator station, then toward me. "It is," someone said. "Your daughter really pulled it together." The word daughter hovered for a fraction of a second too long. My mother smiled, nodded, said, "She's always been helpful," and moved on. The deflection did not hold. Helpful was not the right scale anymore. My father tried again, inserting himself into a conversation that had turned logistical. "We had a whole team on it," he joked, gesturing broadly. The laughter that followed was polite and thin. The people listening already knew which team he meant, and it did not include him. Cole grew quieter as the evening continued, staying closer to Savannah. Not embarrassed exactly, exposed. I did not redirect praise. I did not deny it. I did not clarify credit. I answered questions when they were asked briefly, accurately, without commentary. Each answer settled something for the person asking, and each settlement loosened my family's grip on the narrative. When my father finally approached me again, it was not with authority, it was with caution. "Everything okay over here?" he asked, concern shaped like reconnaissance. "All good," I said. And it was true in a way he could not access. He nodded, searching my face for leverage that was not there, then turned back toward the room. His movements felt reactive now, not directive. Nothing dramatic happened. No scene, no reckoning. The party continued, but the axis had shifted. The VIP table no longer pulled the room by default. Conversations branched elsewhere. Laughter sparked in corners that did not require approval. People sought out whoever could answer the question in front of them, not whoever looked best answering it. The loneliness I had carried earlier thinned into something sturdier, being seen without being recruited. I did not need defenders. I needed witnesses. Across the room, my mother watched someone drift away mid-conversation to ask me something ordinary and necessary. Her smile faltered just briefly, then returned louder, brighter, as if volume could replace gravity. I met her eyes once, not in challenge, not in reassurance, just acknowledgement. She looked away first. I did not feel victorious. I felt steady. The truth did not need my voice anymore. It was already moving, carried by people with no reason to protect the illusion. The party was still moving, but the rhythm no longer held. Conversations started and stopped without the smooth transitions that had characterized the earlier hours. Laughter arrived a beat late, as if people were checking with each other before committing to enjoyment. The center of the room loosened, and the VIP table stopped pulling attention by default. I noticed it in the way people stood, half turned toward one another instead of fully oriented toward my parents, small groups forming without checking where the gravity used to be. The room was not silent. It was listening differently. The question that brought everything into the open came without force. A man I had seen once that day, one of Savannah's uncles, waited for a natural pause in the conversation near the bar and asked, "So who decided how all of this was put together?" He smiled pleasantly. He was not confronting anyone. He was simply curious. My father stepped in immediately, his voice smooth and familiar. He spoke about teamwork, about collaboration, about how events like this always came together when families worked as one. He spread credit carefully, gesturing without landing anywhere specific. People nodded out of habit. A few did not. The answer sounded complete until it was not, until it failed to match what the room had already observed. Someone followed up gently about the timing change from the ceremony. My father answered again, referencing a decision that had not been his. A flicker crossed a couple of faces. Nothing dramatic, just recalibration. Then the woman who had spoken to me earlier leaned forward slightly and asked, "So who finalized that call?" Her tone was calm, neutral, almost inviting. The politeness sharpened the moment more than accusation ever could have. My brother shifted beside Savannah. He glanced at my father, then back at the woman. He started to answer, stopped, laughed lightly, and said something vague about the whole thing being a team effort. The room waited, not impatiently, expectantly. When my father stepped in to elaborate, his response overlapped with Cole's final words by half a second. That overlap mattered. It revealed the choreography. It showed that they were performing rather than remembering. Someone said my name, not loudly, not as an accusation, just clearly. She handled that part right. I did not step forward. I did not offer context or deflection. I answered with precision. Yes. I named exactly what I had handled and what I had not. No commentary, no correction of anyone else's version, just facts. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was decisive. People adjusted their understanding without needing it explained. No one rushed to smooth the moment. The room did not need guidance anymore. It had found a new reference point. My father tried to re-enter the conversation with a joke meant to restore ease, something about how every family had its secret weapons. It did not land. A couple of people smiled politely and turned away, continuing a conversation that no longer required him. He lingered a beat too long, then moved on, searching for a cluster that would still respond the way he expected. From there, the shift accelerated. Conversations split into smaller streams. The VIP table remained elevated and intact, but it stopped anchoring the room. People talked where they stood. They followed curiosity instead of obligation. I did not feel a rush of vindication, just the steady clarity that something irreversible had happened without my pushing. Authority that relies on performance falters when the audience learns to look elsewhere. My mother attempted one last correction with a toast she had already given earlier, raising her glass and calling for attention. People listened. Glasses lifted. The energy did not follow. Applause scattered. Conversations resumed before she finished. She noticed. I saw it in the way her smile tightened as she counted what she no longer held. My brother stayed close to her after that, not attacked, not blamed, simply visible without the buffer that had always surrounded him. I stayed where I was, not central, not hidden. People came to me with practical questions. I answered them. Others passed with nods that acknowledged competence without requiring deference. The room reorganized itself around function instead of status, and no one announced it because no one needed to. When my father passed me again, our eyes met briefly. There was no anger in his expression, just recognition. The rules he had relied on had expired in front of witnesses. By the time the next song began, the transformation was quietly complete. To anyone not paying attention, the party looked the same. To those who were watching, the hierarchy had collapsed without a sound. I did not feel like I had won anything. What I felt was alignment. The relief of no longer carrying the truth alone. And they knew it too. Near the end of the hour, the manager of the venue approached the VIP table with a leather folder in his hands. I watched from my chair near the service area as he paused, looked at the table, then looked around the room as if searching for someone. His eyes found me. He walked toward me, leather folder extended, and said, "The final bill for the evening, $25,000. I looked at the folder without taking it. "That's not my table," I said, my voice calm and clear. "The VIP one is over there." I pointed toward my family seated in their positions of honor, surrounded by the remnants of an evening they had claimed as their own. The manager paused, looked at me, looked at them, then nodded once and walked toward the VIP table with the bill. From where I sat, I watched my father's expression change as the leather folder was placed in front of him. Confusion first, then understanding, then something that might have been the beginning of a new calculation. But this calculation would not include me. The party kept moving without acknowledging that anything had changed, but the shape of it was different now, looser, less directed. Conversations dropped to lower registers, laughter sounded careful instead of carefree, and my family no longer clustered together in the effortless formation they had maintained all night. People still moved, they still smiled, they still congratulated the couple. But the ease was gone, replaced by a cautious awareness that something had shifted and might shift again if handled poorly. I stood near the edge of the room and felt the aftermath without needing to name it. That was when my aunt found me. She took my arm and guided me a few steps away from the nearest group, her grip gentle but insistent, her voice already lowered before she spoke. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be," she said. The sentence was practiced familiar, delivered the way families deliver instructions disguised as concern. She did not ask if I wanted to talk. She assumed my cooperation the way everyone always had. Her next words followed quickly, layered with reassurance that asked for nothing in return except my silence. "You know how things get. No one meant anything by it. Your father just wanted the evening to go smoothly. You understand?" There was no apology in her tone, no acknowledgement of specifics, just a suggestion that the situation could be smoothed over if I played my part, if I stepped back into the role I had occupied for years without complaint. I listened without interrupting. My expression stayed neutral. My body stayed still. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for the nod that would signal relief. I did not give it. I did not argue either. "Thank you for checking in," I said. Nothing else. The absence of agreement unsettled her more than disagreement would have. She hesitated, searching my face for a cue she recognized, then excused herself and moved away, already scanning for someone else who might be easier to manage. A few minutes later, my father approached, slower than before, his posture is less certain. His voice softened into something almost conciliatory. He did not command. He suggested. He framed his words as an attempt to protect the evening, to keep things from becoming uncomfortable for anyone. "We don't need to rehash things," he said, careful not to mention what those things were. "Let's just enjoy the rest of the night." It was an invitation back into the old arrangement, the one where my role was to absorb tension so others could relax. I met his eyes and answered only what he had actually asked. "I am," I said, and I meant it. I did not reassure him further. I did not promise discretion. I did not volunteer to help repair impressions. The restraint forced him to fill the space himself. He could not. He nodded once, uncertain, and stepped away. He glanced over his shoulder as if expecting me to follow. I did not. Near the dessert table, a minor problem surfaced. One of the serving dishes was running low, and the kitchen needed to know whether to bring out more or let the evening wind down naturally. It was exactly the kind of decision I would have made automatically 3 hours earlier. Lila looked toward me out of habit, then caught herself and looked away. She found someone else to ask. The answer took longer than it would have if I had been involved, but it came eventually. The serving dish was refilled. The evening continued. I watched and did not intervene. My mother's sister cornered me near the windows a few minutes later. She spoke in that hushed, urgent tone that people use when they want to seem like they are helping while actually managing. "Clara, honey, I know tonight hasn't been easy," she said. "But think about your mother. Think about what this day means to her. You don't want to be the reason people remember something negative." I let her finish without interrupting. "I appreciate your concern," I said. "But I'm not doing anything negative. I'm just attending the wedding." She blinked, recalibrating. "Well, yes, but the way you're sitting over here, it looks like I'm sitting where I was told to sit," I said. My voice was calm, not angry, just accurate. She did not have a response for that. She patted my arm in a way that was meant to feel supportive and walked away. The choice clarified itself not as a dramatic stand, but as a series of small refusals to perform the labor I had always been expected to provide. I did not explain anyone's behavior to guests who looked confused. I did not contextualize decisions that were not mine. I did not redirect attention or soften reactions. When questions came, I answered them plainly or not at all, depending on whether an answer was actually required. Each non-action carried weight because it broke a pattern everyone had relied on without ever acknowledging. Some people grew uncomfortable, unused to the absence of a buffer. Others adjusted quickly, relieved to navigate the situation without the pressure to pretend everything was fine. My brother felt it more than anyone. Someone asked him directly about a vendor payment that needed to be confirmed before the evening ended. Without me stepping in to translate or mitigate, he had to answer for himself. He stumbled, recovered, stumbled again. No one mocked him. No one attacked. They simply waited, and the waiting did the work. He glanced toward our parents out of habit, but they did not intervene. They could not without drawing attention to the very dynamic they were trying to minimize. He cleared his throat and responded as best he could, and the conversation moved on, leaving him quieter than before. It was the first time I had seen him carry the weight of his own choices without a safety net. The sight was strangely grounding. I did not stay to watch every consequence unfold. At a certain point, observation became participation, and I was finished participating. I stepped away from the main area, not hurried, not apologetic, moving with the same calm I had maintained all evening. No one stopped me. No one called my name. A few people noticed my movement and then returned to their conversations, unsure whether my departure signaled something they were expected to respond to. It did not. The power of the moment came from its ordinariness, from the fact that I could leave without asking permission and without creating a scene. Behind me, the room continued to adjust. Without my presence as a stabilizer, small awkwardnesses surfaced and had to be handled directly. My parents tried once more to regroup, to present a united front, but the effort looked strained now. The choreography was off by just enough to be noticed. Guests gravitated toward easier conversations, away from anything that felt managed. The illusion of control, once cracked, could not be restored by will alone. I paused near the edge of the space long enough to take in the sound of the music, the hum of voices, the sense of an evening moving forward regardless of anyone's discomfort. A woman I barely knew nodded at me as she passed and said quietly, "You handled yourself well." It was not praise in the way my family used the word. It was recognition offered without expectation. I thanked her and let the moment pass without clinging to it. As I stepped outside the main area, the noise softened behind me, not disappearing but receding like a tide pulling back. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. What I felt was the steady certainty of a boundary holding without reinforcement. The party continued without me for a while longer. I could hear it from where I stood near the exit, the music and laughter and occasional cheers that marked the rituals of celebration. None of it required my presence anymore. None of it ever had, I realized. What had been required was my labor, my silence, my willingness to disappear into the machinery while everyone else stood in the light. I was done disappearing. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped outside, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the gardens and the distant smell of car exhaust from the parking lot. I stood there for a moment, breathing, not waiting for anyone to follow, not hoping someone would come after me with an apology or an explanation. Just breathing. The stars were bright above the venue, scattered across a sky that did not care about family dynamics or seating arrangements or the careful calculations people made to protect their positions. The sky just existed, indifferent and vast. There was comfort in that indifference. I heard the door open behind me but did not turn around. Footsteps approached, hesitated, then continued until someone was standing beside me. It was the woman from earlier, Savannah's colleague, the one who had seen what happened and had the clarity to name it. "You're leaving," she said, not a question. "I'm leaving," I confirmed. She nodded, looking out at the same sky I was looking at. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you did the right thing. Not making a scene, not playing their game, just letting the truth speak for itself." I turned to look at her. She was watching me with an expression I had not seen often in my life, respect without agenda, recognition without recruitment. "Thank you," I said, "for seeing it, for saying something." She smiled slightly. "Some things shouldn't be invisible." She handed me a business card. Simple. Her name and a phone number. "If you ever want to talk," she said, "or if you need anything, no strings." I took the card and put it in my pocket. "I appreciate that." She nodded once more, then turned and walked back inside, leaving me alone with the night. The door closed behind her, and the sounds of the party muffled into a distant hum. I stood there a moment longer, feeling the weight of the evening settle into something I could carry. Not a burden, a lesson. I thought about what I was leaving behind. Not just the wedding, but the role I had played my entire life. The reliable one, the responsible one, the one who handled things so everyone else could shine. I had built that role out of love, out of hope, out of the belief that if I gave enough, eventually I would be given something back. But love that requires you to diminish yourself is not love. Hope that depends on your invisibility is not hope. And the belief that your family will see you if you just work a little harder, give a little more, ask for a little less, that belief is a trap disguised as virtue. I was done being trapped. The walk to my car felt longer than it should have. My heels clicked against the pavement in a rhythm that sounded final. Each step was a sentence I was no longer willing to leave unfinished. I reached my car and paused with my hand on the door handle. In the distance, through the venue's windows, I could see the glow of the reception still in progress. My family was in there recalibrating, telling themselves whatever story would let them sleep tonight. Maybe they would decide I had been unreasonable. Maybe they would find a way to make this my fault. They were good at that. They had been practicing it for years. But their story was no longer my concern. I got in the car and sat for a moment without starting the engine. The silence was complete. No phones buzzing with demands. No voices asking me to handle one more thing. Just me and the quiet and the understanding that had taken 32 years to reach. I had spent my whole life being useful to people who saw usefulness as a substitute for respect. I had organized and coordinated and smoothed and fixed, believing that the work would eventually transform into belonging. But belonging cannot be earned through labor alone. It has to be given freely, and it has to be given to who you actually are, not to the function you perform. My family had never been interested in who I actually was. They were interested in what I could do for them. The difference was everything. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the venue behind me. The roads were quiet at this hour, and I drove without music, without distraction, letting the hum of the engine be the only soundtrack. I thought about what came next, not with anxiety, but with curiosity. I had a job I was good at, an apartment that was mine, friends who knew me as more than a problem solver. I had a life that existed independently of my family's expectations, and I had neglected it for too long in favor of chasing approval that was never going to come. That life was waiting for me. It had been waiting all along. The city lights grew brighter as I approached my neighborhood. Familiar streets, familiar buildings, the ordinary comfort of a world that did not require my performance to continue existing. When I parked outside my apartment and turned off the engine, I sat there for one more moment. Not sad, not angry, just a present. I thought about the chair my father had pointed at, the single seat near the service area designed to keep me visible enough to summon but invisible enough to ignore. I thought about the years of chairs like that, the years of margins and edges and almost belonging. Those years were over. I got out of the car and walked to my door. The key turned in the lock with a familiar click. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and stood in the quiet of my own space. Tomorrow I will start building something different. Not better necessarily, just true. A life where my value was not measured by how much I gave up for people who never thought to give back. A life where boundaries were not betrayals, and silence was not compliance, and asking for a seat at the table was not the same as being entitled. I did not need my family to see me anymore. I could see myself. And that was enough. If you have ever been expected to stay quiet just to keep the peace, if you have ever been the one who handled everything while everyone else took the credit, if you have ever sat in a chair someone else chose for you and wondered when you would be allowed to stand, I want you to know something. You are allowed to stand right now. You are allowed to walk away from tables that were never meant to include you. You are allowed to build your own table with your own chairs and invite people who see you for who you actually are. It is not too late. It is never too late. And it starts with the simple, radical act of refusing to be